Good morning, everybody, and happy Tuesday. Welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana, and thank you all for giving me a day off yesterday. I appreciate it. But while I was off yesterday, there was something really big that happened over in the AL.com and Reckon world. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And that is a new podcast by Reckon Radio called Unjustifiable. And Unjustifiable chronicles the tale of Bonita Carter and her killing in 1979 in Birmingham. Its creator and host, John Archibald, is here today with me to talk about the podcast, to talk about Bonita Carter and her legacy that really led to so much change in Birmingham and really just for civil rights in general. So we will leave a link here to John's column about the podcast, about the case of Bonita Carter. And there is also a place where you can listen to that episode there as well. So, John, I know this is a big deal, this podcast, and this is a story that hasn't been told in depth in a long time, if ever.
Well, it's been told in ways that they're mowing the grass right outside my window.
That is always the way it happens. You're good.
I don't know if I can turn it or not. Yeah, it happened in 1979 when I was a sophomore in high school at a school just not far from where Bonita Carter had recently graduated from school. So I'd heard about it all my life. But as I started really looking into this, really in the wake of the E.J. Bradford shooting in Hoover, kind of realized that so much of what I thought I knew about it was wrong. And it made me look a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And it really did change Birmingham in ways a lot of people just don't realize.
Something that I thought was really interesting was that this case, Bonita Carter, she was shot by a police officer in 1979 in East Birmingham, if you're not familiar. And that's kind of the crux of this whole conversation. It's if you aren't familiar, and unfortunately, so many people are not familiar with the story of Miss Carter. Now, I know I was born and raised in Birmingham, and I am ashamed to say that I did not know the true story behind Bonita's case and behind her killing until really recently when y'all started working on this podcast, and I started looking in a little bit more. But John, I don't think, while I'm ashamed to say that, I don't think that, I think a lot of people, rather, are kind of in the same boat that I am. Born and raised here, but never heard this story.
And frankly, that's mostly white people who haven't heard the story or who have heard it and remembered it wrong. And that's one of the things we explore in the podcast is why this sort of rewriting of history, why this lack of memory, because, really in the Black community, Bonita Carter and her death is known widely as really the reason that, 16 years after Martin Luther King marched in Birmingham and 14 years after the Voting Rights Act, that Black voters in Birmingham finally coalesced and said, enough is enough. I mean, we have to have a change here after, decades of pointing out police violence, after decades of pointing out police shootings. There was finally the killing of Bonita Carter mobilized Black voting and gave Birmingham its first Black mayor long before people thought that was possible.
Now, we'll go ahead and recap if you're just joining us. We were talking about the new podcast from Reckon Radio called Unjustifiable, which tells the story of Bonita Carter, her killing in 1979 by a police officer. This happened in East Birmingham. And this story was not widely talked about, widely known, especially by the white community, as John mentioned. And that is what this podcast is doing, telling that true story. But, John, I have to ask you, now this happened in 1979. It's 2020. I know you started working on it before 2020, but why was this the time that you thought that Bonita's story needed to be heard?
Well, like I said, I started looking at it after the E.J. Bradford shooting in Hoover on Thanksgiving night. And in the wake of that, I was really struck by the sort of lack of transparency of information coming out of Hoover and what was going on there. And I recalled that in the Bonita Carter case, there was really an amazing sort of hearing that was set up then. It was a public hearing in which witnesses to this crime were subpoenaed and brought before this committee to give testimony about what they saw, and all of that was recorded in remarkable detail. And so every bit of that investigation really is recorded in the files. And so, really, in light of the lack of transparency we've seen in many places these days, to look back and say, wow, it's hard to believe that 40 years ago we were way more transparent than we are today. And so that's what started me looking at it. And then it really became relevant to everything that's going on in the world this year.
Now, there is something too that you had said in your column, and I'm sure this will be something that, maybe we hear about a little bit more in the podcast. I haven't heard the other episodes, so I don't know that for sure. But the officer who shot Bonita Carter, which is not, from my understanding, in question. We know that person and their name. And there was a note that was passed along to you from this officer, this former officer, saying that given the same circumstances, he would shoot Bonita again.
Yeah, George Sands, and he has not wanted to talk to us about it. He has declined to talk to us, and we, for the most part, we got our producer got a few comments from him. But early on in that process, I went through an intermediary, a friend of his, and asked some questions, and he essentially said he didn't want to talk, but to say that given those circumstances, he would do it again because he felt like he followed procedures. And, that was one of the great controversies of this whole case, is that the mayor at the time looked at the case, and even though he had more than a dozen complaints against this police officer in the past, it felt like he followed the procedure. And he followed his training, even if that training was bad. It was, they thought it was more of a systemic sort of problem than a problem with this officer, which was one of the things that this is really important for, because it changed those procedures, and it made it began the dismantling of the police department that had been built by Bull Connor, and so that was really significant. One of the things we find in here, and as we ask, why did Bonita Carter motivate a city to change? It was that past. If you look at the 3 decades preceding her shooting, there were 213 killings by police in Birmingham, in Jefferson County, 200 of which were black men, which is an astonishing number. And time after time, civic leaders, black civic leaders and religious leaders would stand up and say, look what's happening here. You killed 10, 12 people this year, and shot in the back, just for being suspected of something. And nothing ever changed. So in my mind, all of that history led to that one moment in 1979 when this 20-year-old woman got into a car and was mistaken for someone else.
I want to touch on something you just said, but first I want to quickly circle back, because I know that we had some people doing yard work outside your window, so it might have been a little hard to hear. I want to quickly say again, you mentioned Bonita being 20 years old in a car in East Birmingham, and I know that we talked about this story not being really talked about, especially in the white communities in Alabama and Birmingham, but something that was so striking to me when I listened to the first episodes of this podcast that are available now, the description of Bonita and the fact that she was 20 years old. I mean, she's younger than I am, and that had never sunk in with me. And when I had heard the name Bonita Carter before very recently, I had not imagined somebody younger than me, just so young and full of life. And I think about all the experiences I have had since the age of 20 that obviously Bonita was not able to have. John, was that important to you to humanize Bonita Carter in this telling of her story?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to see her as a person and not just a symbol and a martyr. And she was a recent high school graduate from Hayes who sang in the church choir. Who was known for singing, if not with the best voice, with a lot of enthusiasm. Who liked to dance, and who was always talked about with a a smile on her face and those sorts of things. And she was remembered as someone who, really would give people whatever, the shirt off her back. Well, that's probably not the best expression, but so she was helping somebody when this happened, and that it all sort of fits into the model. So getting to know Bonita Carter was really an important part of it, and getting it. Go ahead.
Something that I thought that you mentioned in your previous answer was the situation in which Bonita died, but also the dozens of people that were being killed by police in Birmingham in those years leading up to 1979 when Bonita was shot. What about Bonita is what made Bonita Carter the catalyst for protest, the catalyst for the election of Birmingham's first Black mayor? What was it about Bonita in specifically?
That's one of the questions we really delve into deeply, and it's a lot of things. It is those numbers, the decades and decades and decades. 500 people over the course of since 1909 in Birmingham, in Jefferson County, have been shot by police. But it's most of them were men, most of them were Black men. The fact that she was a young woman who was trying to help somebody out, and it was perceived largely in the community as innocent, was a large factor. It was people talking in there about it being the last straw, and how the waves of the news just went out across Birmingham in the Black community particularly, and just shocked people into a sort of awakeness. Not that Black people in Birmingham didn't know that these things had been going on. They did. White people didn't pay attention, but Black people knew how police treated them in the city, and so that she became a symbol for change when change was desperately needed at that right time, which happened to be 35 years before Black Lives Matter.
And speaking of that, I have to ask you something that I think that you've probably heard a lot of times before, and that is, why are we bringing up a story from 79? What does that have to do with the situations today? And, what relevancies do you see from Bonita's story to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the things that are happening in 2020?
Well, because you don't know anything if you don't know the context, if you don't know the history. If you look at nothing is in a vacuum, not this shooting, not the shootings of George Floyd, not Breonna Taylor, none of that. And to understand fully the anger and the outrage, the just exasperation, the enough is enough sort of feeling that's going on in this country today. It's not just about any one incident. It is about a long and broad history of injustice across it, not just in the South, not just in Birmingham, not just in Jefferson County, but across this country. The fact that we can look at Jefferson County right now and say, wow, look at these numbers, look at these actions, look at these events, look at these people. To me, if you can look at that and not understand the anger that's in this country right now, then that baffles the mind. But it gives us a glimpse into why we are where we are.
I believe that you were in the Birmingham region in 1979 when Bonita was shot and killed. Do you remember that day? Do you remember being told what had happened?
I don't remember that day. I remember that it happened. I went to Banks High School, which is not far from Hayes High School, which, like I said, we played in every sport we played. And so they were, part of the community. But I don't remember that day, but I remember not long after, because it became, in the days after, it became protest. The Klan came to town. The national civil rights groups came to town. It were protests in the streets. It altered the election and everything about the election. And if you can imagine an election in which, the name David Vann, Richard Arrington, Larry Langford, John Catapodis, the head of the Don Black of the Ku Klux Klan, all ran for office at the same time. It was those names are very large in Birmingham, and so the spectacle of that alone was memorable. And that Richard Arrington, the first Black mayor, won that race, and with the prime directive, he thought of reshaping the police department was a significant moment.
Do you see parallels in Bonita's case? We know that the title of this podcast gives it away, Unjustifiable, saying that the public, no matter what the courts said, the public viewed this shooting as unjustifiable. There are many shootings in recent years, even this year alone, that the public views as unjustifiable of Black people, of people of color. And we have seen protests erupt after those shootings. We have seen influences on elections. Do you see those direct parallels between Bonita and today? And do you talk about that in the podcast?
We do talk about that. There are parallels, yes, and Unjustifiable. Part of that. I mean, we found that this file that dealt with all of the shootings by law enforcement of people over these decades, and the name really came from that. Is because back before Bonita Carter, essentially. It was not just legal for police to shoot what they called people they suspected of being fleeing felons. If a police officer thought that somebody was a felon, had committed a felony, they could shoot them in the back if they ran away. It didn't matter. So, in case after case after case after case after case of the shootings from the beginning of time, essentially to 1979 in Birmingham, people were shot and almost instantly ruled the case. It was instantly ruled justifiable. So this is not just about Bonita Carter. It is about a long history of shootings of people which were essentially rubber stamped as justifiable. And one of the things we found in this podcast is that even though those laws applied, shooting a fleeing felon was expected, it didn't happen to white people. White people didn't get shot. Black people did. So on its face, this was the law, but in reality, it was handled very differently based on race.
This happened in 79. 2019, just last year, there was a sign erected in East Birmingham in honor of Bonita Carter. I'm not great at math, but from my understanding, that's about 30 years, 3 decades after her shooting to that sign being put up in her honor. John, why did that take 30 years?
40.
Even worse at math than I thought.
Yeah. Well, there was a sign there. It was a small sign that marked her death, and it had been up for a long time, and it had faded and grown and had some disrepair. I think probably. I mean, the city of Birmingham, Randall Woodfin's office, the Office of Human Rights, had wanted to put up a new marker with more information, with more of a historical context, and did so. And Bonita Carter's family members came and people from the city, and that was done. I do think that it is likely, has to do also with what's going on in the country and what's going on even then in the country, and a more of awareness of how of Black Lives Matter, essentially, and of the people that had been involved, been hurt by it.
I'm seeing a comment from somebody who says that Bonita is her aunt. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts on the situation and this conversation. Excuse me. Now we have another comment. I want to quickly talk about it. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. People do mine all the time, but I believe it's from Tyra, and she says, all of a sudden, some white people woke up and realized what Black people have been talking about and going through for ages. And John, that was kind of something we talked about, saying that the white community really didn't talk about Bonita Carter's death. But if you were in the Black community in Birmingham, you knew the story and you knew a lot more about it than the white people in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that's largely the point. And it is sort of remarkable that the gymnastics that a lot of people in the white community have gone through to remember this in a way that is less objectionable, and I think that's, when I remembered this, and it's not like the story was mistold in the press at first. It's that the way people remember it I'd like to see a psychological experiment on how it's done. But I mean, like I always remembered, oh, Bonita Carter got in the car with a friend of hers who was going to go rob a store and got shot. But that's not what happened. It's not what happened at all. And so it's really interesting to see how people's, I mean, she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right.
What do you say to people that say she shouldn't have been, or that, and I don't know if this is, I haven't gotten to the point in the podcast where this was a fact or not, but a lot of people say, look, she was reaching in the glove box, and they kind of leave it at that.
Well, there's no evidence to that whatsoever. First of all, I mean, and a lot of things people say to defend the officer is just completely false. And, ultimately that committee that we talked about dealt with that issue pretty concisely and said that there was no evidence to indicate that she did anything that she deserved to be shot for.
Did you run into any sort of problems or hesitation other than the officer who shot Bonita to talk about this case?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of people who don't want to talk about it because there are a lot of people who never want to talk about anything that has a racial component to it because they fear what they'll say and what kind of reaction they'll get. And there are a lot of people in law enforcement who didn't really want to talk about it because there were, for whatever their own personal reason. And a lot of the people who were witnesses to this in the first place are no longer with us. So those are the biggest problems. But there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about this and who care deeply about it.
6-part series, Unjustifiable by Reckon Radio. The first 2 episodes are out now. The next 4 episodes will be released each Monday through December the 14th. You can get this podcast on any platform you prefer. John, what do we get out of these first 2 episodes, and what can we expect for the next 4?
Well, I hope, most of all, I hope I hope you understand who she was and why she was important and how this really all went down. And maybe even more important than that is to understand the context in which she was killed and how many other people, how it happened to so many other people and still does.
Find Reckon Radio's Unjustifiable wherever you get your podcast. Again, first 2 episodes out now. You can find the next 4 weeks. Each Monday, you will get a new episode. John, thank you so much for coming on, explaining this, telling us a little bit about Bonita Carter, and kind of explaining why we should get to know her story.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Everybody watching, thank you for tuning in.